Now, let's go to the situation with NATO. CNN is reporting Trump would break sharply with U.S. foreign policy tradition. Trump, in a New York Times interview published yesterday, outlined a sharp break in U.S. foreign policy tradition, suggesting the U.S. would not defend NATO allies, such as the Baltic states, against Russian aggression if they, quote, hadn't fulfilled their obligation to us. Trump has repeatedly made the case that most of NATO's 28 member countries are not making the requisite financial contributions for their common defense. And he said in the past, the U.S. must be prepared to let these countries defend themselves. His comments were met with shock and anger in some quarters, drawing stern rebukes from members of both parties. And let me tell you what this boils down to, okay? If they can't or won't pay for their own defense, as Trump said himself, there is going to come a time at which the U.S. can no longer afford to defend all of them for free. And at that point, they're going to have to pay 100% of their defense. We're not even going to be there to help them defend it. And we won't be able to defend ourselves either if we destroy our economy. He's made that point. He made that point again. I'm going to read you a quote from him in just a second. But the other part of it is this. All of these neocons who are jumping up and down about the fact, how could we do this? Understand that while the U.S. subsidizes these socialist welfare states that are very large in Europe, okay, we're getting poorer. And they can have these welfare states because they don't have to pay for their defense. One of the guys who came back and made a case for this was, and we'll talk about this when we come back, was from Estonia. He says, well, we're one of the 5 that meet our 2% defense expenditures commitment. 2% of their GDP? Give me a break. Is that it? Only 5? Are you kidding me? Out of all the European countries? Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and before we went to break, we were talking about the interview that Donald Trump gave with the New York Times yesterday, talking about how he saw our involvement with NATO. Essentially, hey guys in Europe, you need to start paying some of your defense. It's absolutely amazing when we think about this. And again, the 2 points are that eventually they're going to have to pay for their defense because they're going to bankrupt the United States if we have to carry everyone. And if you think that's an exaggeration, hang on, I'll show you that it's not. The other part is that the U.S. is subsidizing these economies who do not want to defend themselves. And what we're really subsidizing is their soft welfare state. They're socialist states. Why should we subsidize that and get poorer in this country? I don't understand. And I think most Americans don't understand it either. Now, Trump went on to say, as he was being interviewed by the New York Times, he said, this is not 40 years ago. He also suggested the massive expense of maintaining an international order that's contributing to trade losses for the U.S., quote, doesn't sound very smart to me. Doesn't sound very smart to me either. He went on to say, quote, we're spending a fortune on the military in order to lose $800 billion. Now, as they talked about this, of course, Hillary Clinton is all for this, okay? Business as usual with Hillary Clinton. She's going to be there for the banks. She's going to be there for the military-industrial complex. She's going to be there for every vested interest, folks. Nothing is going to change, except it's her turn to be in power. That's really what this is about. She goes on to say, it's fair to assume that Vladimir Putin is rooting for a Trump presidency. And I would say, I would agree with her on that, quite frankly, because Vladimir Putin, I don't think, wants a new Cold War any more than the American people want a new Cold War. But you have to understand the military-industrial complex that backs Hillary Clinton very much does. George Soros very much does. Victoria Nuland, Obama's person who was channeling and admitted the billions of dollars that they put into revolutions. And as they have these drills right at the massive NATO drills right at the border of Russia, does that make us safer? Of course it doesn't. They're incredibly expensive, but they're incredibly dangerous. These are tripwires. And when they tell Vladimir Putin, don't worry, they're just exercises, you've seen the clip. He looked at him and he just started laughing like, you're kidding. You're kidding. You can't possibly be stupid enough to believe this is not a threat. This is not an implied threat to go right up to the... What would you think? What would you think if the Soviet Union were to hold massive maneuvers right at the U.S.-Mexico border? Okay, if Mexico had an alliance with, I know they're in the North American Union now, you know, the North American Free Trade Association, which is trying to make a union. Isn't it interesting that today, what tone-deaf blindness for Obama to meet with the Mexican president today and have a little kumbaya session. You know, the two amigos. They had the three amigos meeting a couple of weeks ago. What an amazingly stupid photo op for him to do, to drive home the idea that he's not working in our interests, but in the interest of foreign countries. But let's understand for a minute. Let's imagine that they weren't joined at the treaty, at the hip, and they had an alliance with Russia. What if Russia or China were holding massive military exercises right at the border of Mexico and Texas? Do you think we would feel threatened? Do you think we'd be alarmed about that? Do you think they would just tell us it's just a drill, nothing to worry about, we're not getting aggressive or anything? And as we went to break, I pointed out Hendrik, president of Estonia, one of the NATO member countries, said in response to what Donald Trump was saying, he said, well, Estonia is one of 5 NATO allies in Europe to meet its 2% defense expenditures commitment. Think about that. Only 5 European countries meet their 2% defense expenditure commitment. Only 5. And they can only come up with 2%. I mean, it's 2%. That's setting the bar pretty low, don't you think? Look at the massive amount of money that America spends on the military, and I think it's far too much. We spend, we have a military budget that is by far and away the largest budget. We have the largest army. We have the biggest expenditures. We just put out a new aircraft carrier. Well, it's not gone out. Actually, it's running about 2 years late, but there's been a new article talking about how it's been delayed now to, I think it's November of this year that it's supposed to go out. It was scheduled, I think, for September of 2014. A giant aircraft carrier, biggest one we've had. It's almost $13 billion. It's not launching planes as it's supposed to. We just put out another Navy ship not long ago that was supposed to be a stealth ship for close-in patrol. It broke down after 50 miles. They had to tow it back in. Give me a break. There's no backup on a military ship. This is a sorry state that we've gone to because of the military-industrial complex bleeding us dry with these boondoggles. Stay with us. As we were talking about NATO in the last break, you know, one of the people who came to Trump's defense, interestingly enough, was Nigel Farage. And one of the things that he said was, he said, I think the American military the last few years has been pretty unhappy with their NATO allies who have just kept cutting their defense spending. He added that NATO was a wonderful vehicle to keep the peace in Europe for 60 or 70 years, but NATO now does need to redefine itself. What is it for? We don't have the Warsaw Pact. He says, I'm pro-NATO, I'm pro-cooperation, but it's not a bad thing that we reassess what it's for. And of course, this has been something that's been talked about in many circles for quite some time. It's one of the reasons why they have gone out of their way to revive the Cold War with Russia, with these provocative moves in the Ukraine, the region, okay? Now the country, and now the country Crimea, trying to push that. One of the things that happened, and I mentioned this in a special report, you can see it at Infowars.com, is a interesting insight into, again, Ted Cruz. The guy who has so many backers on Wall Street, the military-industrial complex. He had one of his backers here, a delegate from Texas, tried to put some language in the platform that would call for maintaining and increasing sanctions against Russia and providing lethal defense weapons to the Ukrainian military. And they report in the Washington Post that Trump staffers in the room, who weren't delegates, but who were there to oversee the process, intervened. They worked with pro-Trump delegates. They were able to get the issue tabled while they devised a method to roll back the language. And then she was put on the sideline, and she was kind of upset. She says, I was troubled when they put aside my amendment, and then they watered it down. I said, what's your problem with a country that wants to remain free? It seems like a simple thing. It's a very simplistic way to look at this. Clearly, either she doesn't understand what the Obama administration and George Soros and the military-industrial complex are doing in terms of trying to start another Cold War and perhaps a third World War in order to sell us gigantic ships that don't work, long-range bombers. You know, you can't make a case for long-range bombers and a lot of tactical nukes if you don't have a Cold War, if you're just fighting their war on terror that they're creating. So they needed to go back and revive the Cold War again to start up those profit centers. They've got a new profit center with the war on terror, and they can have a new profit center with the militarization of the police and creating a civil war here in this country, pitting Black Lives Matter against the police and equipping and arming both sides of them and encouraging that division. But they still want to have that old profit center back too, because you can never have enough money or power with these people. So they have to revive the Cold War. And they point out, they said, what they did was they replaced her language calling for lethal defensive weapons with softer language that called for appropriate assistance. Because we don't want to be tweaking the nose of Russia to start another war. The American people understand that. There's a lot of people in the Democrat Party that should understand that. Should understand that Hillary Clinton does want to escalate things. She's as hawkish as any of the people at the upper level of the GOP. And if you don't want a third world war, don't vote for Hillary Clinton. If you want to try to de-escalate that tension, you've got one choice and one choice only. And that's Donald Trump. They said Trump's view of Russia has been friendlier than most Republicans. He said he would get along very well with Vladimir Putin. And, Hillary Clinton said, well, Vladimir Putin must be very happy must be rooting for a Trump presidency. I think he would, because I don't think anybody in their right mind wants a world war or a Cold War.
We're selling a product, DNA Force, that is the very best nutraceutical that we can produce. Dr. Group, you took years for you to develop DNA Force for us.
It's been something that I've been working on for a long time, Alex, because I think it's very, very important. What the aging process is when the cell replicates, we lose a little bit of our telomeres. Telomeres are the little cups on the end of our chromosomes.
And when it runs out, you start dying.
We chose the PQQ because it has over 175 different clinical trials. It's one of the most effective substances in the world. It works like an antioxidant. It works to repair nerve growth factor.
So this is a formula to deliver the maximum amount. It's in powder form.
We have so many 5-star reviews. I take this. This is the product that I take.
InfoWarsLife.com, and the profit we make. We fight the globals. We fight the New World Order. Secure your DNA Force today at InfoWarsLife.com or call toll-free 888-253-3139.